Colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, please be seated. May I ask you all to be seated, including the two gentlemen? Right. So the next item on our agenda is the exchange of views on the situation in Ethiopia, which we are holding as AFET jointly with the Committee on Development and the Subcommittee on Human Rights. I therefore warmly welcome Chairman Thomas Tobe for DEVE and Udo Bullmann for Droit, who will co-chair this item. For this item, we welcome Dr. Sarah Vaughan, who is a social scientist, a former honorary fellow from the University of Edinburgh, and who has co-authored a number of books on Ethiopian politics. She is connected remotely. We also welcome Mr. Frederick Lee Olson, who is the director of the World Food Programme Brussels office. He is present here in the room. He's sitting up front next to us. We also have three institutional speakers present today: Mr. Charles Chapouli from the EAS, Mr. Mark Stallmans from the Commission's Directorate General for International Partnerships, and Ms. Beatrice Miege from the Commission's Directorate General for European Civil Protection and Humanitarian Aid Operations. All three are responsible for Ethiopia in their respective services. Before I now give the floor to Thomas Tobe and Udo Bullmann for their introductory remarks, let me recall that the conflict in northern Ethiopia is soon going in its fourth year. The Tigray, Amhara, Afar, and Oromo provinces are massively affected, and access to help and the basics of livelihood is blocked for millions of people. In October last year, the United Nations issued a stark warning of the heightened risk of genocide and atrocity crimes in Ethiopia. 10 days ago, the state of emergency in the Amhara region, originally declared in August last year, was prolonged by the Ethiopian Parliament for another 4 months, giving the government of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed the powers to restrict movement, ban public gatherings, and impose curfews. Ethiopia is involved in an unresolved water dispute with Sudan and Egypt, and creates, through its engagement to recognize Somaliland, further risk of turmoil in the neighborhood. We shouldn't forget that Addis Ababa hosts the African Union, and that a spread of insecurity to the capital region could severely undermine its functioning. The security situation in and around Ethiopia is serious. It is serious, and the deterioration is unfortunately not ruled out. All conditions are united for the EU to act to prevent further deterioration of the situation inside the country and in favor of promoting stability in the entire region. I now give the floor to Thomas Tobe.
Thank you, David, and I think it is very good that we could have this exchange together between AFET, DEVE, and DROIT. It is not the first time that we discuss the overall situation in Ethiopia together. As you know, this country is facing multiple challenges, and it is important to look at this in a holistic way. For many years, Ethiopia was one of the closest partners to us in the region, with the country perceived as the anchor of stability in the Horn of Africa. As we know, the situation changed with the eruption of the conflict in the Tigray region, which led to the EU at the end of 2020 to freeze budget support and suspend preparation of a multi-annual indicative program under the NDC instrument. The multi-annual indicative program with Ethiopia for 2024-2027 was launched in October 2023, after the parties to the conflict agreed on the cessation of hostilities in the Tigray region, and because the Ethiopian government made commitments on the peace process and transitional justice and reform. It is now, I would say, a source of great concern to see that the conflict in Amhara region, which erupted last year, has further intensified with reports of alleged violations of human rights. Despite reports from the federal government of improved security, the parliament decided last week to extend the state of emergency in the region without paving the way for a peaceful solution to the conflict. To make matters worse, several regions in Ethiopia are affected by a severe drought. Millions of lives and livestock are at risk, with reports of alarming food insecurity and rising malnutrition. It is estimated that the number of critically food insecure people will continue to grow over the next few months. Urgent humanitarian assistance is required, notably in Amhara, where the situation is further worsened by the conflict, and in Tigray, where communities have yet to recover from the last conflict. Our exchange today will allow us, hopefully, to understand better the scale of the humanitarian needs and the food security situation in the country.
Udo. Thanks, colleagues, Thomas and David. Let me first of all highlight that Ethiopia is a key partner for the European Union in the Horn of Africa, a region of tremendous strategic significance. After the change of power in 2018, many of us observed with hope a country that appeared to be on the way of a historic transition to democracy after years of authoritarian rule and turmoil. Unfortunately, as colleagues highlighted already, the Tigray war brought that transition to a sudden halt. Today, and despite the signing 14 months ago of the Pretoria Agreement that meant an end to the hostilities, Ethiopia is still struggling to regain peace and stability. The new conflict in Amhara is currently the most alarming. However, it is far from being the only place in the country where civilians are targeted and killed in significant numbers, particularly because of their ethnicity. In recent months, the National Human Rights Institution has also reported large-scale extrajudicial killings, mass arbitrary arrests and detentions, sexual and gender-based violence, and the use of child soldiers. On a positive note, the federal government is committed to fostering reconciliation and preventing internal conflicts through a process of national dialogue and to scaling up accountability for human rights violations by establishing a transitional justice policy. Today's meeting gives us the opportunity to take stock with our guests of the efforts made by the Ethiopian authorities in this direction. Last December, a delegation from my subcommittee led by Ms. Isabel Wiesner-Lima visited the capital Addis Ababa and Mekele in Tigray. I would like to warmly thank our 4 members of the delegation for their work, and I look forward to hearing their views and those of our guest speakers on the human rights situation and the prospects of our country in Ethiopia.
Thank you, Udo. Without further delay, I will now give the floor to our 2 guest speakers. They will have 7 minutes each. We will start with Dr. Sarah Vaughan. Her intervention will set the scene of the political situation and the challenges faced by Ethiopia. So, Ms. Vaughan, you are connected, I think, digitally or remote, as we say. You have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning. My name is Sarah Vaughan, and I am an independent researcher, and these remarks reflect my own views. They're not made on behalf of any other institution. I've been asked to give you a brief overview. I will make 6 points, starting at the macro level and concluding with the more specific. Firstly, geopolitics. I see weakness and dependency. In my view, Ethiopia's sovereign decision-making power is weaker than at any time since the Derg regime, when the military government was strongly dependent on the patronage of the Soviet Union. The Horn region is more violent and more volatile than at any time since the 1980s, and the influence of foreign powers, particularly but not only the Gulf states, is stronger. This has exacerbated violence of civil wars in both Ethiopia and Sudan, and the toll on civilians. The Ethiopian Prime Minister's striking new saber-rattling in relation to the country's need for access to the sea, inverted commas, last year directed towards Eritrea and this year arising from Ethiopia's controversial MOU with Somaliland, has contributed to destabilizing the region. In the last 6 months, Ethiopia has increasingly antagonized its neighbors with little evidence of gain of its national interest. Secondly, the economic picture, which is also one of dependency, here just about averting collapse. Ethiopia's revenues from taxes and exports continue to decline, with the latter artificially boosted by the export of minerals. Mining is increasingly important, and it comes with high levels of conflict risk. Proposed economic reforms, including devaluation, will, in my view, do little to address the deep dysfunctionality of the Ethiopian economy under current policy, but it will exacerbate the erosion of service delivery. The scope for leverage on the part of the IFIs or European partners should be carefully considered in a context of high levels of largesse, particularly from the Gulf states, but also including Chinese debt rescheduling. Thirdly, the domestic political level. Ongoing concentration and personalization of power in the person of the Prime Minister, who again shuffled his cabinet this week. This is an increasingly regular pattern, and on this occasion demonstrated just how far the pool of political loyalists on which he's able to draw has shrunk, particularly amongst Tigrayan and Amhara politicians. Over the last 6 months, prominent Oromos and Amharas have withdrawn from the ruling Prosperity Party, and along with key opposition figures, many are now based outside the country or jailed. Fourthly, the erosion of state delivery capacity. One of the most important and least talked about effects of the last decade of underfunding and political centralization has been the disintegration of local state delivery capacity in health, education, agriculture, or relief. One of Africa's most effective developmental states is now subject to widespread inertia, corruption, or collapse at the micro level. Many of the data sets key to performance evaluation have been discontinued or eroded. Fifthly, I agree with the pessimism already expressed in the introductory remarks. Unresolved domestic conflict continues in at least 3 important regions to drain the resources of the country and boost human rights abuses. In Amhara, a popularly supported but fragmented insurgency has seen the army deployed since August last year in an increasingly bloody campaign. As has been noted, a 6-month state of emergency was recently renewed, and on the 29th of January, between 50 and 80 individuals are believed to have been killed at a town near the regional capital. Unconfirmed reports indicate execution-style killings by the army going door to door. This is not a war which can be won militarily, and it is unlikely that it will be resolved by negotiation in the near future. Secondly, in Oromia, the 5-year insurgency of the Oromo Liberation Army in the west came close to a negotiated settlement in November last year, after weeks of work between the OLA and the military, before failing at the last minute. Fighting continues. In both of these regions, the government has closed the internet, and journalists have been precluded from travel and arrested. In Tigray, although the cessation of hostilities agreement has held since November 2022 with no fighting between the signatories, key tenets have not been implemented, notably the return of nearly 1 million IDPs to Western Tigray. Frustrations between Tigrayan and federal authorities are escalating, with many Tigrayans seeing an ongoing federal prosecution of war by other means over the last year. Finally, the return of starvation and famine. The failure of the 2023 harvest is precipitating widespread starvation in eastern Tigray, northern Amhara and Afar, at a time when international funding for humanitarian activities is low. In Tigray, last year's harvest saw only 37% of the production of a normal year. This comes on top of 3 years during which the war eroded the resources of the rural majority, caused by looting and destruction, by the withholding of salaries, by the closure of alternative livelihoods options, trade, migration, credit, small enterprises, and by the halting of safety net transfers, which supported 1 million Tigrayans before the war and which have not since resumed at this scale. The suspension of food aid between March and November last year because of a national scandal of misappropriation was the final straw for many peasant farmers. In my estimation, many thousands have already died. The resumption of aid is welcome, but it will need to be massively scaled up if many tens of thousands more are to avoid the same fate. Allow me to conclude, Mr. Chairman, by commenting that since my first visit to rural Tigray in 1988, exactly 35 years ago at the end of the Derg period, I have never seen the rural economy in northern Ethiopia in such a desperate state as I did in November and December last year. Thank you.
Thank you a lot, Dr. Vaughan, for this introduction and also being so precise. We will now move to our second intervention that will focus on the drought, the food security situation and the humanitarian needs. So, Mr. Fredrik Lee Olsson, Director of the WFP Brussels office, please.
Honourable Chairpersons, distinguished members of the Development, Foreign Affairs and Human Rights Committees of the European Parliament, I'm honoured for the invitation to address this esteemed assembly today on behalf of the World Food Programme, the world's largest humanitarian agency. For millions of people worldwide, WFP's emergency relief during crisis is the difference between life and death. While numbers are not yet available for 2023, in 2022, we assisted some 160 million people worldwide. On any given day, WFP has 6,500 trucks, 20 ships and 140 aircraft on the move. We can do this with the support of generous donors, as we're entirely funded through voluntary contributions. And in this regard, we are grateful that the European Union, through the Commission and its member states, are a top donor to WFP. And it is needed. As we have entered 2024, a staggering 309 million people around the world are facing acute levels of food insecurity in the 71 countries with WFP operations and where data is available. Honourable Chairs, today I bring to your attention the gravity of the situation in Ethiopia, where a perfect storm of interconnected crises threatens the lives and livelihoods of millions, placing Ethiopia on the verge of a humanitarian catastrophe. We confront an urgent and escalating humanitarian situation in Ethiopia. Humanitarian assistance remains an essential lifeline for 20 million Ethiopians, and we estimate that 15.8 million people are currently food insecure and will require food assistance throughout this year. At the heart of the crisis lies the convergence of multiple shocks, each compounding the other with devastating consequences. The people of Ethiopia are grappling with overlapping shocks of armed conflict, climate shocks, disease outbreaks, and the spectre of rising inflation. Many parts of the country have been or continue to be ravaged by hostilities, resulting in prolonged displacements of currently 4.5 million people and enormous humanitarian needs. The impact of these challenges is particularly acute in the northern regions of Afar, Amhara, and Tigray. Despite our concerted efforts, the situation continues to deteriorate, with emergency levels of food insecurity expected to spread across these regions, including Tigray. Additionally, over 1 million people in Ethiopia's southern regions are still grappling with the lingering effects of the most recent drought, which was the worst in 40 years, caused by 6 consecutive failed rainy seasons. Ethiopia has, over the past several years, been affected by recurring droughts, increasing in both duration and frequency due to the climate crisis. Due to both domestic and global economic shocks, the inflation rate in Ethiopia is among the highest recorded globally at over 30%. As a result, prices of essential commodities have soared, while the purchasing power of Ethiopians continues to be eroded. Allegations of widespread food aid diversion and its impact on food aid distribution have also deepened pre-existing vulnerabilities and contributed to food insecurity. Honourable Chairs, as members of the European Parliament, your attention to the humanitarian situation in Ethiopia underscores the importance of action. Let me therefore outline 3 strands of action that we, as a humanitarian agency, consider are needed to prevent further deterioration. Firstly, there is an urgent need for immediate and sustained humanitarian assistance. Our teams are working tirelessly to deliver life-saving food assistance to those in need. However, our efforts are hampered by severe funding shortfalls. Unless aid is provided at scale in the first quarter of this year, millions of Ethiopians will be at risk of a major humanitarian catastrophe. Secondly, I want to make a plea together with our sister agency UNHCR on behalf of the refugees in Ethiopia. Ethiopia is the 3rd largest refugee hosting country in Africa, with almost 1 million refugees, mainly from South Sudan, Somalia, Eritrea, and Sudan. These individuals have fled conflict and persecution in their home countries, seeking safety and refuge in Ethiopia. However, funding shortages have forced us to make ration cuts for close to 90% of the refugees already, and they are now receiving rations equivalent to only 60% of their daily needs, leaving them both vulnerable and hungry. If we do not have funding, WFP will be compelled to cease food distributions to refugees from April, further exacerbating their suffering and despair. Finally, I wish to emphasize the importance of resilience-building programs in Ethiopia. While immediate relief is essential, the international community must also invest in long-term solutions to break the cycle of food insecurity. That is why in WFP we are implementing programs to tackle the root causes of hunger by strengthening communities' resilience to future shocks and reduce the humanitarian needs of tomorrow. By empowering local communities to build sustainable livelihoods and food systems, we pave the way for a more resilient and food-secure future for all Ethiopians. Honourable Chairs, in conclusion, I urge the esteemed members of the European Parliament to lend support to our efforts to address the humanitarian situation in Ethiopia. The time to act is now. Through solidarity with the people of Ethiopia and partnership with WFP, it is possible to avert a major humanitarian crisis and provide hope to millions of Ethiopians in their time of need. Let us stand together as champions of compassion and humanity, offering a lifeline to those who need it the most. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lee Olsson from the World Program. I will now hand over the chairing to DROIT Chair, Mr. Bullman.
Thanks to our guests. I will now ask our newly elected chair of the Africa-EU Joint Parliamentary Assembly. Congrats again, Max Orville, to take the floor for 2 minutes. But before, let me ask those who would like to take the floor as coordinators, replacement of coordinators, or our colleagues here in the room to signal that to us so that we can organize for a speakers list. Show your hands and then we are able to doing that. We know and took note already, and you will be the first speaker, Michael, after Max. Max, you have the floor.
Merci, messieurs les présidents.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you to the experts. Colleagues, the humanitarian crisis facing the Ethiopian people is catastrophic. 2 years of war, extreme drought in the Horn of Africa, 20,000 people in need of humanitarian aid. It's an intolerable situation. The promise of peace from the Prime Minister has not been adhered to. The government is putting greater pressure on the population despite the embargo and the blocks in the press. I reiterate the request of the European Parliament in its resolution of November 2020 to give immediate and free access to all humanitarian associations. This is absolutely necessary. The peace agreement has not solved all the problems. I'm delighted about the first progress for access to education with a view to peace in the future. But we need to be very cautious, and here I insist on the situation in situ. The aid, European aid, needs to reach the people who need it. We regret the side-stepping of the rules on humanitarian aid. We need freer, more transparent humanitarian aid channels. So my call to the government would be give yourselves the means to receive the aid for the people who need it most. We call for close cooperation between the EU and Ethiopia, the strategic partnership, historic bilateral agreement from 2016, and the multi-annual program 24-27 shows how committed Europe is to Ethiopia. Let's continue to work together to strengthen the links between the EU and Africa. Thank you.
Merci, Max. Next speaker is Michael Gahler, who will take the floor also on behalf of Isabel Wiesler-Lima from DWA EPP, who led our mission to Ethiopia in December. Please, Michael.
Yes, I'm reading out her statement. So thank you very much. Together with Jody Soler, Richard Czarnecki, and Evin Inchir, we were welcomed to Addis Ababa from the 17th to the 20th December 23. The mission was primarily focused to discuss ways to advance respect for human rights, restore peace, reconciliation, and prevent internal conflicts. Thanks to the great work of our Secretariat and the EU delegation on the ground, the program was very complete with many high-level meetings and exchange with local and international civil society organizations and experts. The delegation also traveled to Tigray 1 year since the cessation of hostilities, which, as we know, were dreadful and cost many lives and uprooted many more people. It is highly difficult to summarize the visit in a few minutes, but I will do my best. In the context of the 1 year anniversary of the cessation of hostilities in Tigray, the colleagues and I noted with preoccupation that despite the cessation of hostilities, the situation in that region remains very difficult for the thousands of internally displaced persons. We had the opportunity to receive first-hand information from organizations working in the field, providing support to victims of abuses and humanitarian assistance to IDPs, in particular victims of sexual violence. But during the visit to the country, different actors highlighted that tensions are rising between the central government and other regions such as Amhara, Oromia, which are considerably bigger in population. It is important to note that the federal government is committed in scaling up an accountability process. For example, the setting up of a broad, inclusive national dialogue process to which the EU provides financial and political support has been an important step forward. Nevertheless, the process of transitional justice, which is of the utmost importance this process remains insufficient. In addition, we also have concerns about the potential abuse of the state of emergency to imprison journalists, civil society actors, and even parliamentarians. However, it is important to highlight the highly complex context that Ethiopia is facing, not only internally but also regionally, as the Horn of Africa is among the most unstable regions in the world. Finally, I want to commend the role of our EU delegation on the ground. They are doing a fantastic job in finding the right balance between providing all types of assistance possible, while also putting pressure on the authorities to improve the rule of law and their human rights record. I would like to highlight that, as we have seen during the conflict in Tigray a bit more than a year ago, the scale of violence and death can reach alarming levels. The current situation in the country is quite worrisome, and if it remains unaddressed, it may lead to a scenario even more disastrous. Ethiopia is one of the most populous countries in the world. It is too big to fail, as we heard during our visit. I would urge us all to keep the matter high on our agenda and to offer our help in any way we can. The current geopolitical context has drawn attention to other areas of the world, but we must show our solidarity and support with the region. We should keep this promise. The Commission has allocated around 650 million euros through the multi-annual indicative program of the NDICI for budget support that would be released upon the condition of clear commitment from the side of the Ethiopian government. I do believe it is the right approach, but I believe more needs to be done still in some form of humanitarian assistance. Again, I would like to thank the Secretariat and the delegation for their amazing work. End of quote. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Isabel, both of you, for the report of our mission. Next speaker is Carsten Lucke for the SND.
Thank you, Udo, and thanks to the speakers. I would like to comment on two issues, two pillars. And of course, the first one is, like Mr. Leosen said, on the humanitarian aid. And just in our first session this morning, we were talking about, in the DEVE committee, about the funding gap on humanitarian aid. And if you, just to remind ourselves, if you compare back, what I just heard this morning is we were kind of short of 40% back in 2018, and it was back in 2023, it was 39%. And if you look at this year, we are just at 1% what we need. And even if we get back to the numbers from last year, that would even be a shortage of 50%. So, I mean, it's obviously, and many speakers said it today, that there is really a big gap on humanitarian aid. And of course, we as the Europeans have the commitment to deliver here, even though these are just, from my point of view, the symptoms. And I would like to go back what the first speaker said at the very end, when she talked about that the negotiations will be the ones that bring maybe an end to this conflict, or at least open the way to really have successful success in the very end. So my question, if I'm right, the EAS is in the room. I would like to hear, how good are we to go really to the root causes? How good are our communication channels towards the federal government, towards the regional authorities there? Are we only in the backbenches and always complaining about what is happening, or do we have these communication channels, and how good they are? And if they are bad, can we do something better to really speed up diplomacy, to really come to a conclusion, to be a bit better on this conflict? And if not, then we have to be honest about this. And is there maybe other players whom we can support to do a step further? So I would like to learn a little bit about this, to really go back to the root causes. And I know humanitarian aid is very important, but it's just something that we have to do just to keep the situation as it is right now and to make it a little bit better. But in the very end, we should work on really doing a really step forward on, well, solving, in inverted commas, this conflict. And this would be interesting for me to hear from EAS especially. Thank you.
Thanks, Carsten. Very valuable questions, not only to our expert, as Carsten already indicated, but also to our institutional speakers, whom we ask to take on these elements. Jordi Soleil is the next speaker, who was also part of our mission. Jordi.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Indeed, I was taking part in the mission last December, and I would like to comment on three issues: the situation in Tigray, situation in Amhara region, and the access to the Red Sea. On Tigray, we went to Mekele. We visited an IDP camp. We had meetings with the regional authorities and with the African Union monitoring and verification mission. The Pretoria Agreement is in general being implemented. Humanitarian aid has been restarted, but we came back to Europe with the impression that there was especially one issue that could jeopardize the implementation of the Pretoria Agreement in Tigray, which is the situation in Western Tigray. As you know, Amhara forces control the biggest part of this region of Western Tigray. The military presence of Amhara forces prevent many IDPs to go back home, and this is to my understanding a very serious situation. The authorities in Tigray complain about selective implementation of the Pretoria Agreement because, as per the agreement, the situation in the status of Tigray should be reversed as per the constitution, and they read this provision as Amhara forces should go out from West Tigray. So I think this is a big issue that deserves the attention of the international community and, of course, our attention. On the situation in Amhara, of course, the human rights violation going on there are something which should be of concern to everybody. We have received reports on particularly civilians having been targeted in the town of Merawi. The state of emergency has been prolonged recently, so the situation in Amhara is getting worse by the day, and it should also deserve our attention. The access to the sea, that was a question that emerged practically in every meeting that we had. This is a national priority for Ethiopia, being the most populous landlocked country in the world. When we were there, the decision to have the access through a port in Somaliland had not been taken yet, but I would like to ask the experts on how the situation may evolve, given that this access to the sea is in exchange for the recognition of Somaliland, and of course that has prompted protests from Somalia. So how the situation in the region could evolve on the basis of such a controversial decision. And finally, one comment from my side: the re-engagement of the EU with Ethiopian authorities has to be conditional on the respect for human rights and conditional on the transitional justice mechanism. We had meetings with the Commission that is preparing this transitional justice strategy. We were convinced that they were doing a lot of efforts to put together a credible strategy, but this has to be seen. I mean, this strategy has to be credible, and it has to be a comprehensive strategy involving also criminal procedures. So our re-engagement has to be tied, has to be linked with, mainly to my understanding, to those two issues: a credible transitional justice mechanism and the improvement in the human rights situation in the country. Thank you.
Thank you, Jordi. Next speaker is Beata Kemper, ECR.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. First of all, I'd like to warmly thank you for the possibility to hold this discussion and for all the interventions by our experts and everyone else who's deeply concerned with the fate of those who mostly need help in Ethiopia. This conflict has almost lasted for 4 years, and we still think that it should be in the center of attention of the international community. We may not allow the international community to forget the conflict, as it is of key importance also in the geopolitical context. Concerns related to the humanitarian crisis and the lack of food security, the lack of access to basic services is still crucial. It remains a huge task not only for the international community, but also for all those who are lending their help to all the NGOs. And here I'd like to help them. I know that there are many missionaries and many missionary women who work in hospitals providing services to the poorest. The conflict has led to a dramatic humanitarian situation where it's millions of people who need it. Whereas the access of humanitarian organizations to lend their humanitarian assistance has been restricted. And this should be the topic, the main topic of our talks. Those humanitarian organizations should have unlimited access to the civilians who are suffering. I have a question to our experts. What kind of help is mostly needed? What is the top priority in terms of assistance? How else can we, as the European Union, can contribute to meeting the needs of the weakest social layers? The conflict in Ethiopia has got an international dimension, and my other question is, how can the regional dynamics and the engagement of such countries in the region as Eritrea or Sudan impact the situation in the Horn of Africa? How else can we help? Thank you very much, and thanks for this discussion.
Thanks, Beata. I now have Mike Wallace as the next speaker for GUE, the left group. Mike is the last speaker of the first speakers of the groups, but since we only have 3 additional ones, I would suggest that we immediately continue in this sequence. And after Mike is going Maria Arena, SND, to take the floor, Perrette Herzberger from the Greens, and Malte Gallet from the Greens also. And then I will give back the floor to our experts, our guests, before finally our institutional speakers from the External Action Service and from the Commission will take the floor. Mike, it's you.
Thanks very much, Chair. I'd just like to ask 2 quick questions to Sarah Vaughan. First one, you spoke of the increasing influence of the Gulf states in Ethiopia. I'd like you to describe how you see their present role in the country and what impact it's having. My second question concerns the EU. Very often when the EU is dealing with characters that are seen to have been behaving poorly, we have two different approaches. We either say, oh, it's very important to keep the channels open, or we say, oh no, he's too bad to talk to. So my question to you is, given that Abiy Ahmed has shown so little respect for human rights and has clearly been responsible for some serious atrocities, how do you think the EU should be engaging with Abiy Ahmed? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike. Now it's Maria Arena.
Merci.
Thank you. I'll be speaking in French. 2 questions. Firstly, on our expert on humanitarian aid. We know that humanitarian aid isn't conditional, and I think that's the right approach. My question is whether perhaps we should have a conditional approach towards budgetary aid linked to effectiveness and the fact that the government is blocking universal access to that humanitarian aid from all the population. So the regular army and armed groups are blocking access of the entire population of Ethiopia to that aid. And should that be taken into account? And if that is being organised by the government, should we then look at the budgetary aid provided to the government? Because would that make humanitarian aid more effective in the country if we set that kind of condition? Now, I do agree that we needed to send a message to the government of Ethiopia following the peace agreement, following the commitment to that they would follow a transitional justice policy. But I would ask the EEAS, are there binding measures being put forward, I believe, to the Ethiopian government so that we have follow-up not on a 3-yearly basis, but instead a much closer monitoring of the peace agreement and the transitional justice policy? We've all looked at the international investigations into the atrocities committed by the different parties, so it would be interesting to have follow-up that was binding, but also to have support when it comes to some measures for the transitional justice policy. And I'm thinking of what was done in Colombia, for example, with the peace agreement there, with the Truth Commission. Could there be something similar set up, not only with a plan, but also the necessary resources made available to the country to actually implement the plan? Final question. We've talked about access to the sea with the Somaliland agreement. We haven't talked about the dam very much, though, and the impact that that could have, too, on partners such as Egypt. I know there's a great deal of tension there. So it's a question, what's the situation with the dam and the different stages of the dam's construction? Thank you, and filling.
Questions that go directly to our experts, but also to the European institutions. Pirette.
First of all, thank you very much to the experts who've stressed that the situation is exacerbating and is having a direct impact on women, particularly being subjected to sexual-based violence, which dehumanizes them. I think the speaker needs to switch on her own microphone. We seem to be having a room microphone effect.
Sorry. I start again or no? Okay, I am so sorry. So, tout d'abord, je remercie.
So first of all, thank you to the experts for their presentations, because this conflict is continuing and is getting worse and is having a direct impact on women who were subjected to sexual violence and subjected to ignoble treatment, which means they lose their dignity and are dehumanized, like the victims of violence not having access to the health structures which have been destroyed. And that means that they have difficulty in getting medical treatment, and their access to sexual and reproductive health services is almost non-existent, and this makes life very difficult if they get pregnant or wish to prevent pregnancy. Or obviously the European Union does support a health line, but that seems to be aimed more at avoiding child marriages. Women in Tigray are exposed to a high risk of abuse and sexual exploitation. 40 to 50% of women and girls in the Tigray province have been victims of violence. And the commissioner responsible for crisis management declared recently that European solidarity with people who have needs in Ethiopia, unfortunately, is still needed. And the population there does find itself in a very difficult situation. We have clearly a need for humanitarian aid in Ethiopia, and the EU has increased the amount of humanitarian aid it finances, but it's still insufficient. How can we ensure, therefore, that we're meeting the explicit needs of women, not just in the Tigray province, but in neighbouring countries too, where numerous women are the subject of sexual abuse? How do we ensure that the money of the European Union is invested effectively?
Merci, Pierrette, and finally, Malte.
Thank you, Udo. Thank you very much for all these explanations and presentations. I mainly have a question to the World Food Programme. When I was in Addis Abeba, I met with OCHA, and because I wanted to ask them about the situation in Tigray. Well, it's more than a year ago. There was no peace yet. But yeah, when I came then they said like, okay, so yes, I was asking for Tigray, but then he was like, okay, so you want to know about Tigray? Then first we can talk about Tigray, and then we can talk about the real problems. So basically saying, okay, yeah, of course it's a super hard situation there, but it's also mainly because they are the loudest. And that, yeah, there are far more people suffering all around the country, and that this is basically just, yeah, the most popular crisis, and that they also are really struggling to provide aid to all those in need because of the armed conflicts that, for example, their convoys are attacked and so on. So I would like to hear a bit yeah, how much other conflicts, not in the north, but I think they spoke mainly about Nekemte, I remember, how much this is a real issue for you. And also on the other side, I mean, like, yeah, providing aid with convoys, like shipping grain and so on. Of course, it's costly. So I would also like to hear how much you invest in like a decentralized tender process, because this was also what they said, that basically Ethiopia would be able to provide food for everybody if we just organize it in the right way, and so that we do not need so much, Ethiopia would not need so much support from the outside if we just would manage to set up the infrastructure. Right? This would be nice to hear. Thank you.
Thanks, Malte. Let me give the floor first of all to Frederick Lee Olsen, and then afterwards to Sarah Vaughan.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Chair, and let me try to reply to some of the questions that were asked. I mean, I think that number one is really that Ethiopia is really one of the very largest humanitarian crises globally. So let's make no mistake about that. That is, it's one of the places where we have the greatest concerns worldwide. And as I outlined, of course, we are a humanitarian agency mandated with food aid, but I think that several of the distinguished members outlined there are a great many needs. I visited myself Ethiopia twice, including Tigray, and I also spoke with victims of sexual violence that the Honourable Deputy Member of Parliament outlined. So there are indeed, it's a very, very serious humanitarian crisis. And what help is needed? I think really the food is obviously one, but it's really a lot of different areas. I outlined as well in my intervention the plight really of refugees, as it is one of the largest host countries of refugees, and also with an influx additional from what we've seen the crisis in Sudan. There were already 50,000 Sudanese refugees in Ethiopia prior to the conflict in Sudan, and now we have seen an additional 100,000 Sudanese refugees in the country. So the needs are really vast. What the EU can do, I really want to first say that the EU is already doing a lot, and we're doing it really, as I mentioned, with a lot of support from the European Union and its member states. But there is a funding gap, as was pointed out, between the needs and the resources available. In 2019, there were 132 million people globally that needed humanitarian assistance, and now we are over 300 million. So it's almost 3 times as many. And we haven't, and really what we've seen is that we haven't seen a similar increase in resources. I think the European Union, though, set out, it charted a course, which we from WFP welcome, in the Council set out in the Council conclusions last year on addressing the humanitarian funding gap, both internally but also in terms of its outreach. And I think some of you referred to also Gulf countries and others. I think that there were several things that the EU, I think, also can use through its diplomatic contacts to encourage other countries, particularly those that have the economic resources, to do more to bridge the funding gap. What also can be done is, I think, it's predictable and timely contributions. I think that is, we have the privilege through the Director General of for Civil Protection and Humanitarian Aid Operations that are making timely contributions in the first quarter of the year, and that is really critical, and we encourage that. I also think the point that was made by several of the distinguished members, and that is that this is, as I said, it is one of the largest humanitarian crises globally. But there is no humanitarian solution to humanitarian crisis. It is through political solutions. And I think that is really what we, as a humanitarian agency, we can only welcome for the European Union and others to really redouble efforts through itself, through its own diplomatic engagement with parties to conflict, but also through those that have the influence to put pressure to bear on parties to the conflict. And that is really, I think, what is needed when we speak about the Horn of Africa, where we see so much human suffering taking place. So I think that I also did address, the last question that was mentioned. It's not only Tigray. I think I was clear in my intervention about that. It's the northern regions, also Afar and Amhara. And not only that, it's also the southern regions. So I think it's you're very right to point out, a distinguished member, that it's not only Tigray, and that is a very important point also for us to put to bear. And indeed also the issue of bringing down the costs of operations. I think that's why I made a point on really the importance of investing in local communities through resilience programs, and that is really the way to reduce needs and also the need for humanitarian assistance in the medium and long term. So thank you very much for that.
Thanks to you, Mr. Lee Olsen, and it's now Dr. Sarah Vaughan.
Thank you, Chair. I think there were 6 points addressed to me. I'll try to cover them each briefly. Firstly, the notion that Ethiopia could provide food for everyone if only things were better organized. This, in my view, is nonsense. Production has increased in certain parts of Oromia this year, wheat production. But it's clear that domestic prices remain extremely high, and it's very unclear what that total production amounts to. I very much hope that WFP is in negotiations with the government about doing as much as it can to purchase wheat locally, but I doubt that those amounts are adequate to resolve the current situation. I've spent 35 years explaining to diplomats that they should think of Ethiopia as a bit like the Netherlands. If there isn't a strong state there to pump out the water, a large proportion of the population will be underwater. And I think that's where we are now. We're in a situation where we've moved from a government that was extremely concerned under the PRDF period with making sure that the architecture for food security and protection against food insecurity was strong, to a government that has little concern for this issue and probably, in my view, little understanding of this issue. These are a government now led by people who grew up in other much more fertile, much more verdant cash crop parts of the country, and this has its own impact. Secondly, I think it's rather important to stress that all of these conflicts in Tigray, in Amhara, in Oromia, but also elsewhere, the Somali region, for instance, and the Somali-Afar conflict, are all connected, in my view, with a deeper political problem, which is stemming from this determination to centralize power in the person of the Prime Minister. And this is deeply problematic for me, and I think the European Union would be advised to take this extremely seriously. This process means that a number of the initiatives, like a national political dialogue, for instance, or a process of transitional justice, are not really worth much more than the paper they're written on. And much as one would need to continue to engage with these processes, one shouldn't hold out much hope that they will resolve the current situation. What we see is an increasing centralization of power and increasing exclusion and marginalization of those who don't cooperate. And that marginalization is increasingly resorting to violence. I think that perhaps tells its own story in terms of what sort of engagement I would like to see with the current Prime Minister. I think it should be very cautious. I think it should be rather hands-off. And I think it should be very realistic and clear-sighted about what the opportunities really are for political transformation under current circumstances. Thirdly, on Western Tigray, this is indeed an extremely difficult problem, and it is a problem of the making of 2018-2019 transition, which exacerbated tensions between Amhara and Tigray politicians. Again, I think left to their own devices, they could probably find a way to negotiate their way out of this situation. But it's clear that IDPs cannot return to Western Tigray until the security situation is adequate to protect them, and that's not the case at the moment. The prospect of a referendum or of some kind of formalized legalistic process is irrelevant insofar as the security situation doesn't change. A fourth point relates to the role of the Gulf states. The Gulf states have become hugely influential in Ethiopia, and particularly one would stress the role of the United Arab Emirates. This has two significant potential risks from the point of view of European partners. One is that it undermines the leverage with which European partnerships can function. And the second is that it undermines institutionalization in the Ethiopian state's domestic processes. And this also has a knock-on effect on the kind of instruments of EU cooperation and how successful they can be. One of the very concerning factors about the support which has been given to, personally to the Prime Minister by the Emirates government is that it is not through institutions. It represents a huge shift of resources out of the structures of federalism and the political structures of the state into the personal purview of the Prime Minister's office. And this is deeply problematic for many reasons. Fifthly, on Somaliland, yes, it's true that many Ethiopian elites would like to have access to the sea, but it's not clear what that access to the sea really amounts to. If it means a diversification of ports, Ethiopia already had that. It was offered 19% stake in the newly developed port of Berbera in Somaliland with the agreement of Mogadishu and with the agreement of the Somaliland government and with the facilitation of Dubai Ports World. But it failed to pay up its stake, so that seems to have lapsed. But what we now seem to be talking about is something which is much more a military interest in an exit to the sea to use for a naval port, and many experts feel that this sudden announcement of the MOU with Somaliland reflects rather the interests of the Emirates in securing a foothold on the southern littoral of the Red Sea or the Gulf of Aden. I don't expect that the formal recognition process of Somaliland will advance, but it's always invidious to make predictions. Finally, I was asked about regional players, Eritrea. In my view, Eritrea continues to be an important spoiler in the region. and the European Union should be very cautious as to how it engages with the country. It is a terrible, terrible outflow of migrants still from Eritrea. One wonders how many people can be left in the country at this stage. And there is still an important risk of, if not direct conflict between Ethiopia and Eritrea, certainly of Eritrea fostering conflict around the region. I leave it at that point. Thank you, Chairman.
Thanks to our guests for their excellent contribution for our debate. I thank also our interpreters who will stop at 12:30, but we can continue in English. And this is my invitation to our institutional speakers now. I will call, first of all, on Charles Chapuis, External Action Service, Mark Stallmans, DG INPA, and afterwards Beatrice Miege, DG ECHO, for 5 minutes each. Colleagues, you have seen the result of the questions, the result of the debates, alarming numbers of the gap of humanitarian aid, political solutions needed, and full accusations on also Ethiopian representatives and institutions of not living up to the challenge. This is where we are. Charles Chapuis, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My intervention covers partially the questions raised. Dear members of the Parliament, dear colleagues, the conflict in Tigray has put on hold the EU-Ethiopia relation between November 2020, start of the conflict, till the signing of the cessation of hostilities agreement, the COHA, in November 2022. The COHA has opened a new chapter in the EU-Ethiopia relation, paving the way for gradual and cautious EU re-engagement. Since the signing of this agreement in 2022, the EU has continued to normalize its relation with this important country in the Horn of Africa. The EU has then adopted Council conclusion in April 2023 during Foreign Affairs Council, which clearly states that we would be ready to support further progress on the path towards lasting peace based on sustained implementation of the COHA. Since then, in October 2023, Commissioner Urpilainen was in Ethiopia to announce the resumption of the multi-annual indicative program without budget support, though. Nevertheless, significant and ongoing challenges remain. It was mentioned previously. The EU is seriously concerned about reports of ongoing human rights violations and abuses committed throughout Ethiopia, and in particular in Oromia and in Amhara regional states, notably since the proclamation of the state of emergency, which has recently been prolonged. Last summer, the EU joined the African Union, the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, and the Ethiopian National Dialogue Commission in calling for the protection of civilians, for cessation of hostilities, and for a dialogue between the parties. Last October in Geneva, during the 54th session of the United Nations Human Rights Council, the EU expressed its concern about the findings of the International Commission of Human Rights Experts in Ethiopia, the ICRI, and took note of the government's strong commitment to bring forward a solid transitional justice policy framework, and stressed its expectations that the government would fulfill that commitment and ensure that the future policy would meet regional and international human rights standards. In January this year, EU Special Representative for Human Rights, Mr. Eamon Gilmore, was in Ethiopia to engage with the different stakeholders in the accountability transitional justice process. Accountability and transitional justice are core elements of the COHA and a crucial milestone for the EU for a full and strengthened strategic engagement with Ethiopia. They are indeed crucial in view of the full normalization of EU-Ethiopia relations, since they are the backbone of lasting peace and reconciliation. Later in January, the Ethiopian Working Group on Transitional Justice released with delay a report proposing a way forward, which has still to go through validation workshops before a draft legislation is to be adopted by the government for approval and sent to Parliament. This report presents the outcome of the public consultations conducted by the working group throughout Ethiopia in 2023. It is rather comprehensive and provides some good conclusions and recommendations for the transitional justice process. Among the key recommendations, a number of institutional arrangements are envisaged. It is recommended to create 3 commissions on institutional reform, truth-seeking and reconciliation, and reparations, as well as the creation of a special court and a special procureur's office. However, the main question today is whether the government is willing to actually implement all these recommendations in practice and make the necessary legislative reforms. The EU has constantly conveyed the message at several occasions and to different Ethiopian authorities at the highest level that the absence of such a policy would potentially damage EU-Ethiopia current normalization process. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Charles Shapili. Still alarming messages from your side as well. Mark Stahlmans for DG INPA.
Thank you. The Commission agrees completely that the situation remains very fragile in Ethiopia, and we should remain very prudent in that context. The war in Tigray has ended, yes, but we are still facing a lot of challenges quickly, because it was already mentioned by the previous presentators. So the risk of internal conflict, the situation in Amhara demonstrated. The continuation of the state of emergency also is threatening. The implementation of the COA, the peace agreement, is ongoing but very slow, leading to raising tensions with civil society. Human rights abuses, accountability show also slow progresses. The macroeconomic situation is dire after 2 years of war, creating inflation and incapacity for the states to pay interest of debt. In a nutshell, the country is almost bankrupt. The declaration of access to the sea and the memorandum of understanding is, of course, increasing risk of destabilization in the region, and in particular with Somalia and the president of Somalia, Sheikh Hassan. The food aid diversion scandal is not helping because it's delaying our capacity to implement food aid in the region and in Tigray in particular. And the humanitarian situation is very dire, like my colleagues from ECHO will certainly say. So in consequences of all those difficulties, I think that the Commission and INPA are in particular try to adapt its instruments. So those 2 last year during the war, we were continuing implementing project and program, but dedicated directly to population. And we suspended the MIP and the budget support, so for more than 2 years, with clearly 3 asks to the government of Ethiopia: ceasefire, humanitarian access, and accountability on human rights. With the COA and the end of the war in Tigray, I think that basically the 2 first asks, ceasefire and humanitarian access, are met. Not completely, but met. And the third one, with regard to accountability, is still in the process, but not completely. So, as it was mentioned, we took the decision, the EU took the decision to resume progressively our partnership after the signature of the COA. So the first step of this progressive resuming of our partnership was the signature of the MIP in October by my commissioner during a mission in Ethiopia. The second step, we took it also at the end of last year, was to allow EIB and a financial instrument, not budget support yet, to finance back investment in the country. And the third step is that we are in the process of preparing the annual action plan for the year 2024, like in other countries. And in this support through the annual action plan 2024, we envisage to finance support to the National Dialogue Commission. We envisage to support also UNDP in the context of the DDR component of the peace agreement. We are also thinking about financing governance through, for example, the transitional justice or the social cohesion programs. We are financing, and we will be continuing financing, the African Union COA monitoring mechanism. And we are thinking back about investments in terms of digital renewable energy in the context of the Global Gateway Strategy. So we are not yet at the point of the budget report, and okay, that would be my answer to Maria Elena, saying that basically we still have in hand the important component of budget support. We are speaking about 140 million euros still suspended, you know, to continue asking the government, to go on and to proceed better with regard to human rights abuses, humanitarian access, and, the implementation of the COA agreement. Pour répondre à la in English, because of course translators are not there anymore. So is our money well invested in the country? Like I'm trying to say, I think that we have two kinds of answers. And the first answer, of course, is that we try to keep leverage to push for our agenda with regard to the government. But on the other side, we should not forget the population. That's why even during the war, we were continuing financing directly population. Thank you.
Thanks. Mark Stallmans, I'm pretty sure that our three committees will follow up the proceedings against the backdrop of the contributions of our experts, which were very critical. Beatrice Miesch, DG ECHO.
Thank you, Chairman and honorable members. Let me start first by thanking you for having put back Ethiopia on the radar screen of the international community. With a lot of competing crises in the world, as you may know, some at the vicinity of the European Union. It's very welcome to discuss Ethiopia again. I will not, even so repetition has some values in view of the time, I think I will not repeat what has been said by all, basically, the intervenants regarding the very critical humanitarian situation in the country. Indeed, we are very concerned about this more than 20 million people in need of humanitarian assistance. Indeed, we are concerned by the millions of people still being displaced in the country. And on top, of course, climatic shocks. As mentioned by Frederick Lee-Olsen, we are just getting out of an unprecedented drought. Then we've been going through large-scale flooding end of the year, and we are now also in a situation where we are expecting, again, drought and food insecurity in a large part of the country, the northern parts, of course, but also southern part. To respond to one of the Parliament members, indeed, for the Commission, it is very important to look at Ethiopia as a whole. We are not only focusing every time there is something new. We are really trying to look at Ethiopia in a holistic manner. We are, of course, we share all the views that even so the cessation of hostility has been signed, the Tigray crisis is not over. That's very clear. Even so, and indeed, thanks to impact, yes, access has been granted to Tigray, but basically the needs, and in particular in rural areas, are very significant, and we don't see a lot of humanitarian partners being present in all this area. At the same time, we have this new crisis with Amara, the Amara, of course, war, the Oromia, and not to mention, of course, as it was mentioned by Sarah Vaughan, the Somali region, which is never 100% quiet, and Benishangul Gumuz, and you name it. For this new crisis, and in particular for Amara, access is not granted fully to humanitarian actors, which is, of course, one of the issues. We are lacking, I would say, accurate need assessment. And so we may have some figures, we are aware of some of the figures, but I don't think we have the full picture of all the needs in Ethiopia due to this lack of access in some regions. So let me focus a little bit on what would be the ask in terms of humanitarian aid. First, the main concern in Ethiopia will still remain the IDP, the internally displaced people with a large number. not all of them being able to go back to their place of origin. Sarah Vaughan was mentioning in particular the ones still hosted in schools in Tigray because not able to go back to Western Tigray. This is a very big concern because all these people don't have access to basic services. Most of them are sometimes dependent on humanitarian assistance. In view of the low level of humanitarian assistance compared to the needs, this is not sustainable. It has been also mentioned the trauma caused by all the GBV problems in Ethiopia really needs to get a full attention for specialized services to be provided to the victims, who are indeed very numerous. I was also myself in Ethiopia. In October, I met a lot of victims of survivors of GBV, and I mean, the stories are really not nice, and we really need to put a lot of focus on these people. We need also to have, it was mentioned by Frederick Lee Olson, durable solution also for the refugees. Indeed, it's a large, it's 1 million people, it's quite a lot. So there is a need to find more sustainable and durable solution for this population who have been there for a long time, except of course the newly arrived for Sudan. We need to have a better civil-military coordination because all this conflict needs to have a very good dialogue and communication channel between the humanitarian actors and the armed forces in place, being, of course, the official army, but also all the groups and the militia. We were, of course, very concerned by the aid diversion, which has put on hold food assistance for quite a while. Just for you to know that for the Commission, aid in kind is not the solution. We are normally looking at cash assistance because we find it also a bit more dignified. And last point on violation of international humanitarian law. This is widely spread also in Ethiopia. We really need to have this violation investigated and perpetrators brought to justice. We need to protect the civilians and the humanitarian workers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Beatrice Miesch. Back to David.
Right, thank you, Udo, first of all, for running us through this session. I would like to thank all our speakers of today's meeting for their clear accounts on the situation in Ethiopia. I think we all agree that we are extremely concerned about the security in and around the country, that the European Union should engage to improve the lives of the people in conflict-affected regions. We should also increase our efforts to improve the stability in the region. Since we're running late, I'll keep it there. I'd like to ask Thomas and Udo also for their concluding remarks.
Well, thank you, and thank you to our speakers and also our colleagues on your intervention. I think once again, from the DEV perspective, it is clear that we need to strengthen food security in our humanitarian assistance. And politically, of course, we need to remain principled from the EU side. But of course, at the same time, we need to find ways to support the civilian population and also the refugees that were mentioned during this exchange today. I mean, on the political solution, of course, we need to keep pressure on all parties and, of course, continue our efforts, our diplomatic efforts, but it is a challenging road ahead.
Thanks very much, all who have contributed to giving us this very alarming overall picture today. We are also constantly in contact with our friends in Geneva and will continue our dialogue here on the situation, and there is the occasion in the TWA meeting of tomorrow to intensify the discussion on the human rights situation. Thanks for today.
Thank you, Udo. This ends our joint AFET DROIT and DEVE item. AFET colleagues, we will reconvene at 3 o'clock for our joint item with Budge on establishing the Reform and Growth Facility for the Western Balkans.